Contagious Hope is a podcast that is 6 episodes long, and it fits nicely into the season of Lent. And it is being uploaded to the Do Justice podcast of the Shining Waters region of the United Church of Canada midweek. So, as a special edition of the Do Justice podcast. And it focuses on frontline workers who have found creative ways to support some of the most vulnerable among us through this period of COVID, because we know that COVID has exacerbated many of the injustices out there. And I wanted to meet and hear from those whose faith has led them to some really interesting, creative ways to support the people who are most in need right now. So you hear from a retreat center that is transformed to a migrant place of COVID respite and COVID 14-day isolation stays, a trauma responder who's never before in 15 years been into long-term housing and is now been called to 20 long-term care housing since the summer, because the staff are so traumatized. A doctor in Mumbai, although he preferred to call it Bombay, so we called it Bombay, but Mumbai, who's on the front lines of COVID there and consulted on the very first COVID test to arrive in Mumbai. 2 women who are working in the front lines around intimate partner violence at a women's shelter, and they live into that from their Muslim tradition. So, and those working with the homeless. So I wanted to get a spectrum of stories from the front lines. And, you asked why. For me, I'd been seeing as a church minister that so many people felt a loss of control, as well as the grief around the relationships that had been cut off from them, and the work that they were no longer to be able to do in the physical places that they were no longer to be able to be in. There was a loss of control and a sense of being able to do something about this that really grieved a lot of people, in particular my older congregation members, who the retired set, who are really the backbone of the volunteer force in a church, right? They were all suddenly feeling helpless, and that they couldn't participate, right, in fixing the problem, which they had been doing for years. And so I wanted to inspire people as we moved into the second wave to thinking creatively about how they might be called to lean into new ways of supporting each other. And that each one of us, it starts with the belief that each one of us is called, right? That each one of us matters, that our gifts matter, and that we have to think creatively now how to use those gifts if we can't go out, or if we can't, congregate the same way. How do we use our gifts to make sure that no one is left behind, to make sure that we love our neighbor as ourselves? And that question was really on my own heart, and I wondered if these conversations might inspire, and I hoped that these conversations might inspire us to think creatively, boldly, on how we might love our neighbor in this second and possibly third wave of COVID. So the end of each podcast ends with that question to the listener, right? Is how has this inspired you?
How did you connect with Dr. Atish?
So one of our board members of the Stone Soup Network, which is a ministry at the United Church of, which is Windermere United Church Ministry, is from Mumbai and is good friends with him. And when I was asking and telling him about the podcast and telling him I was looking for inspiring frontline workers, he told me this amazing story about his, one of his best friends, who he was university roommates with, who was now a doctor, and both of them are from India, and this young man had decided to intentionally go and do a shift at the hospital in Mumbai. And it's a regular hospital, but it has been converted to a COVID hospital. Normally it has 1,600 beds, and now it has about 1,100 beds because of COVID social distancing rules. But in Mumbai, they, at the start of the pandemic, between all the hospitals, they had 14 ICU beds for over 18 million people. And so to hear his stories of what they were up against, the shortages of drugs, the hospital filling up for several months to the point where they had to turn people who were coming, from great distances, they had to turn them away. To the miracles of people who weren't in any of the special beds because there wasn't space for them to be in the intense care and still surviving. And the horrors of the ones who they thought would survive who didn't. So his story is really moving, and it's particularly connected to Canada in that India is the largest manufacturer of vaccines globally, pre-COVID, right? Most of our vaccines come from there. They are set to be the largest manufacturer of the COVID vaccine, and yet, by the end of this year, only 22% of their population is estimated to be vaccinated because their vaccines are going out. Yeah, and there's a piece there, right, as we listen to these stories, that can be a reminder of that. It's really kind of a metaphor that's really more myth than metaphor, that we're all in the same boat, right? We aren't. Some of us are in yachts, right? And some of us are in the water. And I know myself, I struggle with something that I first heard a Welsh singer, Martin Joseph, quote something he calls the luxury of despair, and that many of us in this time of COVID have the luxury of despair. But those who are literally struggling for their lives don't have that luxury. And it's been important in my own journey, when I find myself wanting to despair at what I have lost, to check the privilege part of that, right? And it's been invigorating in some ways, and to be able to recommit to the work when I remember that despair that I'm feeling is a luxury. And I'm grateful for the guests that have been willing to go on this journey of learning with me. And the editor, Peter Restivo, who's an expert at this and has been offering me some free coaching once in a while when I need it. And of course, grateful for the McGeechee Scholarship and the United Church of Canada Foundation that is making all of this possible.
So, what were the challenges that that the pandemic posed
Yeah,
to your plans?
it's a little heartbreaking right now, because when I applied for the McGeechee Scholarship, it was literally days before the March 11th first lockdown. I think it might have been March 8th. And so I wrote my McGeechee Scholarship in a pre-COVID world, where I was going to travel to the front lines of injustice in Canada and interview the very people who are most affected, and have have the ability to learn with and from them what was needed at this time. And I'm not being able to do that. I was also going to be able to be a scholar in residence at the Emmanuel College, the University of Toronto, and sit among all those books and visit with all those other scholars at the college, and that has not been able to be possible. So it's been very lonely McGeechee year. I've had to readjust to reaching out more to the frontline workers than those who are actually affected, because it's hard to access um, those, right, the recipients of care. Um, but I can reach out to an organization. I can find, links to that kind of thing. So um, there's been a shift in the work of the Medici, but I think it still speaks very much to the spirit of my particular interest, which was in inviting congregations to look at what it means to become activist congregations. Um, I was really interested in churches as being intersectional spaces where different issues collide in those pews and different needs exist. And wouldn't that be a very fertile place from which solidarity and advocacy and intersectional movement making could take place? And I wanted to see where on the landscape it was already taking place. I wanted to hear from those who are experts in areas of injustice and justice making, um, and bring that information back to the congregations, not to study, but to do. So it was sort of like so you think you're woke, now what, right? Um, and the podcasts, are meant to inspire congregations towards action. The Medici Scholarship itself is called the Medici Senior Scholarship, and it's designed to um, provide development, discernment, and direction to the larger church in ways that are creative and faithful and missional. And it's also meant to enhance the work of a particular minister who's sort of in the mid moments of their career, right? Um, Not simply though for personal growth, but it has to have a broader impact on the wider church, um, and have sort of enduring value to the church, leave behind something that can be picked up by others.